Hello and welcome. My name is Barry. I work at Blanchardstown Library, which is part of the Fingal network of libraries. And this is the first of a series of photography classes that we're going to run online. It's open to absolutely anybody, and we'll be keeping the videos up on YouTube, so you can come back to them at any time and learn whenever you want. So we're all stuck at home at the moment, or close to home, and I thought maybe this could be a good time to learn a new skill or take up a new hobby. Photography is one of my hobbies, so I decided now might be a good time to share some of what I've learned over the last 15 years or so. And I decided to put together this class. So there's going to be 3 parts to this course. We're going to start with the technical side of things today, and we're going to look at what's called the exposure triangle. In the second class, we're going to move on to the more creative side of things, and we're going to look at composition. And in the final class, we're going to look at light, which is essential for photography. And before we begin, I'm going to say something that might surprise you a little bit. My aim by the end of this course is that you will never take a photograph again. And that always surprises people when I say it. What I mean by that is I want you to stop taking photographs and begin making photographs. So in order to do that, I want you to be able to take control of your camera. We're going to get the camera off auto mode, and we're going to get you making decisions about the type of photographs you want to take. In terms of equipment, you don't need anything fancy. If you have an SLR camera, that's fantastic, or a bridge camera that allows you to change the settings, that's great too. But if you want to get started even with a simple phone camera, that's absolutely fine too. So I think we'll move on with the first lesson. So there's just a summary about to come up of the 3 main subjects we're going to tackle over the next 3 sessions. I may do a 4th one where I'll add some miscellaneous information and maybe some ideas for the types of photographs you could take, particularly ones you could take close to home within the 2-kilometer radius. But for today, we're going to start with the exposure triangle. Now, before I get going on this, in the description of this video, I will be posting a link to a text version of this tutorial. So don't worry if you don't follow everything straight away. You'll be able to go to that link and see everything I've spoken about today laid out in a text format with picture examples. If you've any questions after watching this, please feel free to put them in the comments under the video, and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. So let's get started. The exposure triangle. What exactly is that? Basically, there's 3 elements to the exposure triangle. There's aperture, there's shutter speed, and there's ISO. And those are the 3 elements we're going to look at today. Now, when you have your camera on auto mode, your camera chooses those for you. I want you to set those settings yourself. So let's have a look at each of them and see what they are and how they affect the photograph. So there's just another illustration of the exposure triangle: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So we're going to start off first of all by talking about exposure itself and what is exposure. So in the simplest terms, exposure refers to how bright or dark a photograph is. Simple as that. How bright or dark a photograph is. And how do we measure exposure? Well, we measure exposure in something called stops. Now, you may hear photographers talking about, oh, I've overexposed it by a stop, or it's a stop too dark. This is what they're talking about. This is how we measure the brightness or darkness of an image. And we'll come across this term a little bit more as we come along. Before we move on with that, I'm going to talk to you about something called a histogram. Now, a histogram is a graph that measures the exposure of a photograph. And most cameras, in fact, I think all cameras by now, have a setting where you can actually see the histogram for any photograph you've taken. So Let's have a look what a histogram looks like. This is it here. You can see that at one end represents the shadows, the other end represents the highlights, so that's the brightest part of the image, and then you've got the midtones in the middle. So you can see that whatever this photograph is, it has quite a big range of tones, everything from dark shadows up to quite bright areas. Now when you're taking a photograph, you can actually turn on the histogram and see this, and it gives you an idea of whether you've maybe overexposed or underexposed the image. The beauty of digital cameras, of course, now is you can see the image on the back of the screen, which is something we couldn't do with film. So you can get an idea straight away if you've got any exposure issues. So I'm going to start off by showing you an example of an underexposed photograph. This was taken in Venice, and you can see straight away, even without looking at the histogram, that it's a very, very dark photograph. And if we look at the histogram, we can see that it's completely bunched up towards this side of the graph, the dark part of the graph, okay, where the shadows are, and there's almost nothing in the midtones or in the highlights area. So this is an underexposed photograph. Let's look at the next one. This is obviously a very overexposed photograph, so it's too bright. You can see it's so bright that we've lost all the detail in the sky. We've lost a lot of detail even in the water. And if we look at our histogram, you can see that it's bunched completely up towards the right, up towards the bright end of the histogram. So there's very little detail down in the dark areas. A little bit here in the shadows, but a lot of it's been lost. So that's an example of an overexposed photograph. And here we would have what we might call a correctly exposed photograph. Now, there's no such thing as the correct exposure. There's the right exposure for whatever photograph you're taking at the time. So if we look at this one straight away, even by looking at it, we can see the difference from the other two. We'll just look at those two again. Here we've got plenty of detail right through the image. We've got the graph showing some areas in shadow right up to the highlights, and we can see everything quite clearly in the image. So that's a well exposed photograph. So the histogram is something you can use on your camera to check your exposures. Now, every camera is a little bit different, so you're going to have to check your manual to see how histograms work on your camera. I think on a lot of phones you can see them as well. Okay, there's another feature on your camera that's very useful. Just before we get to that, we'll just have a little illustration there of our histograms again. So, a normal exposure with plenty of range from shadow to bright. Overexposed is bunched up towards the right, underexposed bunched up towards the left. Now, the image you see in front of you is an overexposed photograph, and you can see that it's flashing. Now, this is a feature on cameras called highlights warning. You can turn it on, again, just check your manual. And what this does is, if you have overexposed your photograph to the point that the highlights are completely lost, or what we call blown out, these highlights are blown out, it means there's absolutely no detail there whatsoever, those areas will begin to flash. So it's a very, very useful tool to have. Just to explain to you, when highlights are too bright, as I've said, they're called blown out highlights. When shadows are too dark, let's go back to the underexposed photograph, they're called clipped shadows. So you want to avoid that where possible. Sometimes it's impossible, but you want to avoid clipped shadows where the area has gone completely black and there's no detail, and you also want to avoid your blown out highlights, as we can see here. So there's two things you can use on your camera that will help you with exposure. Now, let's move on. So, what is the correct exposure? How long is a piece of string? There's no such thing as the correct exposure. There's the right exposure for the photograph you're taking. Take a look at this one. This was taken on the Halfpenny Bridge at night time. It's a dark photograph. It's supposed to be dark. So the histogram for that would be probably a little bit bunched up towards the left of the histogram. And that's fine. It's meant to be a dark photograph. This one here was taken not far from Blanchardstown Library in Clonsilla. Taken in the snow. This will obviously be a very bright photograph. The snow is white. The sky is very bright. So it's going to be a very bright photograph. And that's fine. This photograph here was taken in Temple Bar. It was taken on a cloudy day, so the light is very even. So this would be somewhere in the middle. Okay, it would have an even range of tones. There's nothing particularly very dark or very, very bright in this area. Everything is kind of mid-tone. So just let's have a look again at our exposure triangle. So aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So the first one we're going to look at is aperture. Okay, so like I said already, if you're using automatic mode on your camera is going to choose the aperture for you. I want you to start doing this yourself. So what exactly is the aperture? The aperture is the hole in the lens that you can see here, where the arrow is, that allows light into the camera, and then it hits off your sensor, your digital sensor in the camera, or your film. If you're using a film camera, it's exactly the same principle. So it's the hole that lets the light in. Now your camera can control the size of that hole, and that has an effect on your final photograph. Here's an illustration, and you can see there that the hole can be made quite small or quite large. Now aperture is measured in something called f-stops. Now this is where we're going to get a little bit technical. Here's the strange thing about f-stops. The smaller the number, look at this one here, f2.8, the wider the aperture. The smaller the number, look at this end, f22, the narrower the aperture. So that's a bit counterintuitive. I'm not going to go into the science behind it, but just you remember, the smaller the number means a wide open aperture, a narrow number, or a small number should I say, means a narrow aperture, and then you've got everything in between. Some cameras will go as wide as f1.2, and most cameras maximum f-stop is f22, which is quite narrow. And some cameras can, and lenses can go smaller than that, but generally that's roughly the scale that most cameras will do. So like I said, the smaller numbers, f2.8, actually means a wide aperture. The larger numbers, like f22, mean a narrow aperture. What effect does that have on the photograph? Well, one thing for certain is, with a wide aperture, more light gets into the camera faster. That makes sense. Think about it. If you've got a bucket full of water and there's a large hole in the bottom, the water is going to come out of that bucket quite quickly. If it's a small hole in the bucket, it's going to come out quite slowly. And the same is true for light and your camera. It also affects depth of field. I'm not going to explain that in detail now, but we'll go into that in the next few moments. So, in summary, aperture refers to the hole in your lens that allows light in. You can set it to different sizes. An aperture of f2.8 would be quite wide, an aperture of f22 would be quite narrow. There you can see the aperture on a real camera lens, and again you can see a very wide aperture there. It's nearly completely open at f1.8 going through to f2.8, f4, f5.6. You'll notice these don't seem to have any logic in the sequence. Don't worry too much about that. f8, f11, f16 and f22 you can see is a very, very narrow aperture. So small number equals wide aperture, for example f3.5, larger number equals narrow aperture, such as f22. Okay, the first thing we need to learn about is depth of field, because aperture, your choice of aperture, will affect the depth of field in your final image. So what is the depth of field? Let's look at this definition here. The depth of field is the area of acceptable sharpness in front of and behind the subject which the lens is focused on. Put simply, it refers to how blurry or sharp the area is around your subject. Let's have a look at an example of that. Well, before we do that, I'll just sum up. A wide aperture will give you a shallow depth of field. And a narrow aperture, such as f/22, will give you a deep depth of field. So what do we mean by that? Take a look at this photograph of a cat. She was hiding in a box. I had to wait quite a while for her to pop her head out. And when she did, I set a wide aperture. I set an aperture of f/3.5, so very wide. Now the main effect that had was the cat ended up quite sharp, as you can see, but look at the background. The background is now blurred. Let's have a look at that again. It looks like I'm shooting the cat, but I'm not, obviously. When I took the photograph, I focused on the cat's eye, and the depth of field is the area between A and B here. So everywhere from the front of the cat's face to just behind it would have been sharp. Anything behind that or in front of it that was visible in the photograph will have been out of focus. So look at it there, the cat is nice and sharp, but the background is out of focus. And this can be a nice way of separating your subject from the background. It can give quite a nice effect. Sometimes it's known as bokeh, B-O-K-E-H. So, wide aperture means a shallow depth of field, which means only part of the image is actually in sharp focus, the rest is blurred. Here's another example of that. I used a very wide aperture, again probably of about f/3.5, maybe f/4. And I took a picture of this little souvenir Eiffel Tower, and I had the real Eiffel Tower in the background. I focused on the souvenir, and it meant that the real Eiffel Tower was out of focus in the background, which created quite a nice effect. Here's another example where I've used a wide aperture. Again, I think in this case of about f/2.8, so a very, very shallow aperture. A very shallow depth of field, very wide aperture. And you can see that the droplets here are sharp, but the background is completely out of focus. Even as you go down the leaf, it begins to go out of focus. So there's very little depth of field in there. And this one was taken quite recently in Dublin before the lockdown, of a seagull by the Liffey, and again you can see the seagull is nice and sharp, and our background is out of focus, so I used an aperture there of about f/4.5, I think, so quite a wide aperture, which allowed me to get the seagull nice and sharp and the background out of focus. So, shallow depth of field, that can be quite useful for portraiture. Here's a photograph of my little boy. I'm not a great portrait photographer, I have to say. It's not something I do very often. But this is a very useful technique for people who like taking portrait photographs, okay? Because it separates the subject from the background, which means the background isn't fighting with the subject for attention, okay? So very useful for people who like taking photographs of people, of portrait photography. So again, if you are doing portraits, one thing I will say is always focus on the eyes or on one of the eyes. They say that everything, if nothing is sharp, just make sure at least the eyes are sharp. So you can see in this photograph the eyes are nice and sharp. The background is out of focus. Okay, let's have a look at the other end of the scale now. So we've spoken about photographs where we want to blur the background and we use a wide aperture, so like f/3.5 for example. What if we want absolutely everything to be nice and sharp? So this is something we would use in landscape photography. So here's a photograph taken in the Dublin Docklands, and you can see that everything from this dock plate here in the foreground right to the Samuel Beckett Bridge and the conference centre in between is all sharp. Now, to achieve this, I used a very narrow aperture of about f/22. So this meant that everything from foreground to background was acceptably sharp. Now you might wonder, where would you focus on a photograph like that to make sure everything's sharp? It's different when you're taking a picture, say, of the cat. When you know to focus on the cat or the cat's eyes, or a person, you focus on their eyes. Well, for a scene where you want everything to be sharp like this, the trick is to focus about 1/3 of the way up into the image. So if you were to draw two lines across there, so 1/3 the way up, is I would have focused somewhere around here where the arrow is right now. That would ensure that all of my image would be acceptably sharp. So for landscape photographers, that's something you need to remember. You focus about a third the way into the frame. Not distance, not a third of the distance to the bridge, but a third of the way up from the bottom of the frame. So about here. So again, an aperture of f22, which is the small hole, okay, allowed me to keep everything nice and sharp. Here's another example of that taken in Venice. Again, you can see that the chairs at the cafe here are kept nice and sharp, as is St. Mark's Basilica in the distance. Just to let you know, that cafe, by the way, a coffee there will set you back €15, so at least the view is good. Let's go on to the next one. This is another landscape photograph taken at Carton House in Maynooth. And you can see again that I used an aperture that was narrow of about maybe f16 this time, which was still narrow enough to make sure everything was nice and sharp, from the trees here in the foreground and the path right back here to the bridge in the distance. Again, I would have focused somewhere about here, about a third the way up into the scene, to make sure everything is nice and sharp. Another one here taken in Bruges, beautiful place if you ever get the chance to go. Again, I used an aperture of f16 on this photograph, which made sure that the bridge and the buildings in the distance were all nice and sharp. What about the apertures in the middle? So I've talked to you about the extremes, your wide apertures at f2.8, 3.5, and your narrow apertures at f16, f22. What about the ones in the middle, f8, f10? Well, those are the ones I tend to use when I'm walking around shooting handheld. I'm not using a tripod. I'm shooting handheld in the day, generally when the light is quite good. So this is an example photograph on Bachelor's Walk I took not so long ago. It was a lovely morning with lovely golden light coming in, and I wasn't really in the mood of messing about with tripods, and it wasn't really necessary because the light was strong. So what that will do is it will give me a good balance between giving me plenty of depth of field but also allowing enough light in so that I don't need to use a tripod. Again, I'll explain that in a little bit more detail later. So it's good for street photography, those in-between apertures. Here's another one around Dublin again, shot handheld at about f8. This one was, if I remember correctly. Another beautiful morning, lovely golden light down the Docklands. Those middle apertures are excellent for street photography. This is taken in Paris, street musician, and you have a couple dancing here in the background, so it allowed me to get everything sharp for the most part, and shot handheld. So again, I would have used maybe something like f8 or f9 for a shot like that. So shooting handheld in the daytime is a good time to use those middle apertures. I'll also say something, that those middle apertures, f9, 10, are often actually where the lenses perform at their absolute sharpest. So you can get some quite good shots at those apertures. So let's just have a look at this little chart here that sums things up, and this chart is in the text version of the tutorial, so you'll be able to look back, and maybe it's something you could print out and bring with you and to give you some tips. So again, you just look at this little graphic. You've got a person here with a pyramid in the background. At f22, the small aperture, it's perfectly sharp, and as we open up the aperture, as you see, it's getting bigger and bigger, up to f16, f11, f8, f5.6, f4. As we move along, you can see the background is getting more and more blurred until we go right down to f1.4, which is completely wide open, which means the person here is nice and sharp, but our background is very, very blurred. So again, check that out in the text version of this tutorial, something you could maybe print out and bring with you as a type of cheat sheet. So that's aperture covered. If you don't mind, I'm going to have a little cup of tea. I hope you're all still with me so far. So the next thing we're going to learn about is shutter speed. So aperture controls the size of the hole in the lens that the light comes in. Shutter speed refers to the length of time that that hole stays open. Okay, so it's the length of time that the aperture is open to let light in. Now, wide apertures tend to mean very fast shutter speeds. Think about it, it's logical. If the aperture is very wide, the light can get in very fast. Narrow apertures tend to mean slow shutter speeds, f22. That's why it's often necessary to use a tripod for those type of shots, because if it's a slow shutter speed and you're holding your camera, it's actually quite hard to keep it still if it takes a second or two to take the photograph. It's nearly impossible to keep still by hand holding, although new cameras do have image stabilization, which means it's possible to hand hold shots that we weren't able to several years ago. That said, if you're doing landscape photography, tripod is something you should use nearly all the time, if at all possible. There's going to be occasions you won't be able to, but it's probably the most important piece of equipment after the camera and the lens itself. So again, let's just look at that again. A wide aperture will lead to a fast shutter speed. Again, think of the bucket with the large hole, the water comes through it very fast. Narrow aperture, slow shutter speed. Bucket with a small hole, the water will come through much slower. Now, shutter speeds can vary. They can be extremely fast as 1/10,000th of a second, even faster with specialist equipment, or they can be very slow. In fact, some shutter speeds can be several minutes. The first photograph ever taken took almost a day to take. So think about that. A fast shutter speed will freeze motion, and a slow shutter speed will blur motion. So we'll have a look at a few examples of what I mean by that. So have a look at this picture of a windmill. When we use a slow shutter speed, it could be maybe a shutter speed of 1 second would be considered very slow. Look at the blur. And as we make the shutter speed faster, it's a little bit less blurred. And then with a very fast shutter speed, maybe 1/2000th of a second, we actually freeze the motion. You can see another example of it here with some sugar being poured onto some strawberries. Slow shutter speed of 1 second, and you can see the blur. 1/60th of a second, less blur, and 1/1000th of a second, almost no blur at all. Now, there's no such thing as the correct shutter speed. There's the right shutter speed for what you're trying to achieve. So if you're photographing a particular scene, don't be afraid to experiment with different shutter speeds and different apertures for that matter. Try them in different ways, see what works best, and often there could be two versions of the photograph that work equally well in different ways. I mean, I like all three of these. They all do give something different. I do particularly like the slow shutter speed one though. Something I like to use quite a lot myself. So let's have a look at this one. This is a photograph I took many years ago with a friend. We dropped some dice into a jug of water and used a very fast shutter speed to freeze the motion. And you can see there they've been kind of in suspended animation there. They've been captured at a very particular moment. You can even see individual drops of water splashing out. So that would have been a very fast shutter speed, maybe 1/1000th of a second. Here's another one where I've used a fast shutter speed. This is a fountain in a lovely town called Brive-la-Gaillarde in France. It's where my wife is from. And again, it's a backlit photograph, so the light was strong, which allowed me to use a very fast shutter speed. And again, you can see it's captured individual droplets. So that's a fast shutter speed. I've frozen the motion of the water. It can be useful for street photography as well. This is on Merrion Square, so I wanted to freeze the motion of the cyclist coming past the lovely Georgian building in the background there. So again, fast shutter speeds can be very good for street photography. Sports photography. Again, this was actually taken on a mobile phone, which shows you don't have to have fancy equipment to do photography. Here we see the mighty Leinster in action, I think, against Scarlets. And this was taken during a line-out. You can just about see the ball up in the air here. And again, the whole scene is frozen. So very good for sports photography as well, fast shutter speeds. Now, let's have a look at the other way around. In this one, I wanted to blur the motion of this waterfall. So I used a slow shutter speed. Now, believe it or not, 1/5 of a second would be considered quite slow, and that was about the speed I used here, about 0.2 of 1 second. Seems fast, but it's actually slow enough to blur the water here. So waterfalls is something you can use that with, moving water. So a slow shutter speed there to blur the water. Tripod is essential in this case because there's no way you're going to hold the camera still for that amount of time. Let's move on. Here's some fountains taken in Bucharest in Romania, and again I've used quite a slow shutter speed on this. Again, maybe a third of a second, and it's enough to just about blur the water as it falls from the fountains. Here's an example of a very long shutter speed. This was taken in Brussels, and this is the Arcade du Cinquantenaire, which is a building built to celebrate Belgian independence. And this is actually a 30-second shutter speed. Again, I use a very solid tripod for this, and I even used a timer. Your camera often has a 2-second timer, which means when you press the shutter button, it won't take the photograph for another 2 seconds. This is useful because even the motion of pressing the shutter can be enough to make the camera move slightly and ruin your photograph. So using the shutter, or you can also use a shutter cable, is very useful. So this is what I used in this case, a very sturdy tripod and a timer. And this took 30 seconds to take. And in that time, you can see that the traffic has moved past, and it's captured the light trails of the traffic as it's gone past. And anything that wasn't moving, such as the arcade itself, is perfectly sharp, but we've captured the motion blur of the lights. So a lot of people have seen those photographs and wondered how it's done. Now you know, I hope. This is taken in Grafton Street a few years ago. And in this one I used a slow shutter speed of maybe about 1 second. Maybe it was 2 seconds. And the reason for that is I wanted to blur the motion of the people on the street. Obviously photographs are static, but by using motion blur you can convey movement. So I wanted to show the busyness of the street at Christmas time, people doing their shopping. So I used a wide angle lens for this, again a steady tripod, and it took quite a few attempts to get the shot I wanted, but I finally got the image I was looking for in the end. So about a 2-second shutter speed there allowed me to blur the people. Here's an example of an extremely long shutter speed. This is actually about 3 minutes. I had to use a special filter called a 10-stop filter, or a neutral density filter. It's a specialist piece of equipment that you put onto the front of the lens, and it actually blocks most of the light coming into the camera. In fact, it blocks only 1/1000th of the light gets in, which allows me to use a very slow shutter speed. So this was about maybe 3.5 minutes, if I remember correctly. It's taken in Tunisia, and you can see in those 3.5 minutes the boat hasn't moved, so it's perfectly sharp, but the clouds here at sunset have begun to move across the sky, and they've blurred, creating that very pleasing effect. So you can use shutter speed very creatively if you want to. And again, here we have another chart just to illustrate our different shutter speeds. So 1/500th of a second would be quite fast. You're going to freeze motion, and as the shutter speed gets slower, 1/60th of a second, 1/30th, 1/15th, 1/8th, 1/4, and half a second would be, believe it or not, considered extremely slow in terms of shutter speed. You'll get a very blurred image. So this, again, there's no such thing as the correct shutter speed. There's the shutter speed for what you are trying to achieve with your photograph. Here's just some examples of shutter speeds. If you want to stop the motion of a race car or a pro athlete, you're talking between 1/2000th and 1/4000th of a second. That will freeze that motion. A bird in flight, about 1/1000th to 1/2000th of a second. And we won't look at them all, but landscapes tend to be slower, 1/20th of a second, 100th of a second. Because again, we're generally using a very narrow aperture, so it takes longer for the light to get in. Cities at night, between 8 and 30 seconds, like the one I just showed you from Belgium. Outdoor low light photos in the evening can take between 5 and 30 seconds as well. So as with the slow shutter speeds, you're going to need a tripod. So let's just sum up again. A wide aperture will equal a fast shutter speed, because the hole that the light's coming through in is wide, so the light gets in faster. A narrow aperture will lead to a slow shutter speed. So something like f22. That's where your tripod becomes essential. Okay, so we've now covered two sides of the exposure triangle, aperture and shutter speed, and we're going to look at the final side now, which is ISO. And the beauty about ISO is in the digital age is you can change the ISO each time you take a different photograph, whereas in the film days you had to buy film set at a particular ISO. So what ISO does, increasing the ISO value makes it seem as if your camera is now more sensitive to light. Now that's a very, very simplistic explanation. It makes it seem as if it's more sensitive to light. It's not actually, but it kind of seems that way. Now, ISO is one that tends to cause rows between photographers, and I put up a tutorial before, and somebody got very annoyed with me with my definition of ISO, and this is what they sent me. They told me this is what I should have said, so I'm going to read it to you now. ISO works by having amplifiers in the image sensor circuitry increase the gain before sending the analog voltage read from the photon well to the AD converter to be digitized. Example, if at ISO 100 the signal is 100 megavolts, we can get ISO 200 by using an amplifier to boost it to 200 megavolts. For ISO 1600 we can 5-double it to 1600 megavolts, and so on. So what he said, yeah, listen, you don't have to worry about that. I'm going to explain it to you in a much simpler way. It works, ISO works a little bit like a microphone and an amplifier. You think about it. When you speak into a microphone, you're not speaking any louder, but the amplifier makes your voice sound louder. It amplifies your voice. So even though your input, your voice, isn't any louder than normal, the people listening can hear it louder. It's the same principle. Okay, and I can see a spelling mistake in there already. An amplifier makes your voice seem louder, it should say, even if you don't speak louder. Turning up the volume makes your voice seem louder still. However, the more you turn up the volume, there's lots of spelling mistakes in this, isn't there? The more you turn up the volume, however, the more the quality of the sound degrades. So think about that. Yes, it makes your voice louder, but if you turn it up too loud, the quality of the sound will degrade. And the same is true for ISO. So, increasing the ISO setting on your camera amplifies the light hitting the sensor. So much like the amplifier amplifies sound, increasing the ISO amplifies the light. It's the same amount of light going into the camera, the exact same amount, but it gets amplified on the way in. The light's the same, but is amplified like the sound was. So this means less light is required to make the correct exposure. So let's think of situations where that might be useful. I'm inside, I'm at a party, and I want to take photographs, but the light has become quite low, and for some reason I can't use my flash. I'm not allowed to use a flash, and to be honest with you, the flashes on cameras, they don't tend to look very nice in photographs. So the light is too low. I can't hold my camera handheld without it getting camera shake. The shutter speed is simply too slow. However, if I increase the ISO, that will amplify the light coming in and allow me to get faster shutter speeds. So now I can hand hold my camera. So you might think, well, why don't you do that all the time? I mean, surely we just increase our ISO as high as we want it and we don't need a tripod ever. That's true, but increasing the ISO, as we see here, allows for faster shutter speeds. It's useful if shooting in low light without a tripod. My sister is a wedding photographer. Often in the church she's not allowed to use a tripod and she's not allowed to use a flash. So this is an occasion where she'll have to increase the ISO. However, increasing the ISO will degrade the image quality. So there is a trade-off. Yes, you'll get the right exposure, but the image quality itself may suffer. Now, lower ISO means better quality and cleaner images. Most cameras, their lowest ISO is 100, some go as low as 50. High ISO means noisier or grainier images. For example, a very high ISO might be 6400. They can go even higher than that, 12,000 and higher. So generally, where possible, you want to keep your ISO as low as possible. When I'm shooting landscapes with a tripod, I always put it onto the lowest possible. Sometimes if I'm shooting street photography, I might increase it a little bit, maybe just to ISO 200. It's going to have negligible effect on my image quality, and it means I can get faster shutter speeds. Make sure I don't get that camera shaking. Let's have a look at this picture here. This was taken at ISO 100, so at the lowest ISO, and it's a nice clean image. I'm actually going to try and zoom into it a little bit there. You can see that it's a clean image. I've used a wide aperture, so I've blurred the background and kept the bottle itself quite sharp. So that's a low ISO of about ISO 100. I then increase the ISO up quite high. And even there, when I change, you can see straight away a little bit of a change in the image. Let's zoom in. So the ISO now I've increased to about 6,400. So let's have a zoom in and have a look now. Now you can see that the image has become quite grainy and less clear. So what we call that digital noise, the image has become noisier. Okay, so where possible, we want to keep the ISO quite low to avoid noise. Here's a more extreme example of digital noise. Again, I'll zoom in. This is over 102,000, and you can see you've got little kind of blue and red specks there. It's not very clear at all. Now, that's an extreme example. I can't think of any situations where you're going to increase your ISO to something as high as 102,400. Now, that said, newer cameras tend to handle higher ISOs quite well, especially full frame cameras. So what exactly is a full frame camera? A full frame camera is a camera where the sensor is the same size as 35mm film. Okay. That means the sensor is quite large. Most camera sensors are a good deal smaller than that. The larger the sensor, the more light it's able to gather, and it can actually support using quite high ISOs without degrading the image quality. Now I'm going to just find you an image here as an example of that. We'll just take that away for a moment. So I've said shoot at the lowest ISO you can. However, newer cameras, especially full frame cameras, those which have a sensor that's 35mm wide, handle high ISOs very well. This is a photograph I took only a few weeks ago in Temple Bar, there under Merchant's Arch. I was shooting handheld. I didn't really want to use a tripod here. It was a bit dangerous, there was people walking past, and I wanted to work quickly. So I increased my ISO all the way up to 3,200. And as you can see, the image is absolutely fine. It's a very clean image. There's very little noise in it. So some of the newer cameras actually handle noise quite well. Here's another example. This was in Belfast City Hall. Tripods were not allowed in the building. So in order to get around that, I increased the ISO again to 3,200 and shot handheld, which allowed me to get a fast enough shutter speed to hold that without the use of a tripod, and I was able to get good sharp images. So there's your ISO. Let's just have a look at our ISO scale there. So the low ISOs, say 100 or 50, make your camera seem less sensitive to light. The higher ISOs make it seem more sensitive to light. again, as I said, it's a little more complex than that. It's actually to do with amplifying the light that comes in. So the low apertures will capture less light, slower shutter speed. The high ISOs will capture more light. Okay, fast shutter speeds. The lower ones, we'll just skip to the last one there. The lower ISOs will mean less image noise or grain. So nice clean images. The high ISOs can begin to get quite noisy or grainy. That said, the newer cameras, especially full frame, handle the higher ISOs very, very well. And then we have a chart there just to illustrate again our low ISO, nice clean image, and as we move up to the higher ISOs, they're 12,800, it's getting quite grainy and quite noisy. So let's put all that into practice. Now we know what ISO is, we know what shutter speed is, and we know what our aperture is. Now, so how do we actually put the three of those together to take our photograph? Now, some of you may be using automatic mode on your camera, or maybe one of the semi-automatic modes such as landscape mode or portrait mode. I'm going to show you three modes you can use here. You've got aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual, and these are the ones I want you to concentrate on. Let's start with just how do we find these? If you look at the top of a camera, you'll see something like this. It depends on the make of camera, but they all look quite similar. A stands for aperture priority, S stands for shutter priority. On some cameras, such as Canon's, this is actually TV or time value. They just give it a different name. And M, that's the scary one, that's manual mode. So aperture priority, shutter priority could be TV or manual mode. Let's start off with aperture. I have a Canon camera myself, and on the Canon cameras it's AV is what it says for aperture priority. You can see TV there instead of S. Now, what does aperture priority mean? It's very simple. It means you choose the aperture, the camera chooses the shutter speed. It's as simple as that. You set it to aperture priority, you set the aperture you want. So if you're taking a portrait, you might use something like f3.5, f4 to blur your background. If you're shooting a landscape, you might use f16 or f22. The camera will then set the correct, or what it thinks is the correct, shutter speed to get a correct exposure. That's not too bright or not too dark. Okay, so there's aperture priority. Again, that's how it looks on most cameras. It'll be an A. On Canon cameras it says AV. We'll come back to shutter speed in a minute. So aperture priority, you set the aperture, the camera sets the shutter speed. And again, look in your camera's manual to see how you do that. Usually it's a dial that you move, and you'll see the aperture value changing on the back of your screen. So that's aperture priority. I'll tell you something, this is the one I use 90% of the time. Because when I'm shooting landscapes, which is what I do mostly, urban landscapes or natural landscapes, I'm generally not too concerned about shutter speed. I'm more concerned that I have plenty of depth of field and that everything is nice and sharp. So the next one, shutter speed, does exactly the same thing. Shutter speed, you set the shutter speed, you decide what you want. It could be a very fast shutter speed, a very slow shutter speed, and the camera then will set the right aperture to expose the photograph correctly. So that's shutter speed, and it's the symbol for that is an S or sometimes TV. Okay, now what happens if the image comes out too dark or too bright? So you're using either of them modes. You're using aperture priority or you're using shutter priority, but you look at your image on the back and you can see that it's too dark or it's too bright, or maybe you even look at your histogram and it shows you that your image is too dark or too bright, or your highlights warning begins flashing to show that the highlights are blown out and there's no detail anymore. So what can we do if that's the problem? There's a feature on your camera called exposure compensation. Now, it usually looks like this. This is the button, a little plus and a minus symbol on it. And what you can do is, you've taken your photograph, you've looked at the back, you're not happy with it, so you take it again. And this time you click on the exposure compensation button. And you will see something like this. Remember earlier I spoke about stops? Well, this shows you the stops of exposure in your picture. So your camera will always set your exposure to be at 0. So you set an aperture, it will pick a shutter speed that ensures that's set at 0. However, that's not always the correct value, because some photos are supposed to be bright and some are supposed to be dark. So sometimes you have to override that. So if you find your picture has come out a little bit too bright, maybe it's a stop overexposed, you can turn the dial until the arrow goes to -1, and that will make it a little bit darker. You bring it to -2, it'll make it darker again, or -3 stops, it will make it darker again. The same if your images come out too dark. If you move your dial on exposure compensation to +1 stop, it'll get brighter, and so on up to +3 stops. It'll get brighter and brighter again. So, again, that's the beauty of digital photography. If you have a problem with exposure, you can see it straight away, and you can fix it straight away. That wasn't possible before. Here's what it actually looks like on the back of a camera. This is being used in AV, so that is your aperture priority mode, and the person here has clicked on exposure compensation, the plus minus, and this little chart has come up, and then using the dial up here, some cameras are different, or possibly even the arrows here, you can either go to -123 or +123 to make your image brighter or darker. So that's called exposure compensation, and if you've got an issue with your image being too bright or too dark, that's how you fix it. And there you can kind of see another example of it on a screen. So different screens can look a little bit different, but it's the same principle. Some you can go as dark as -7 stops or as bright as +7 stops. Most cameras do 3 or 5. Okay, finally the scary one, manual mode. In aperture priority mode, we chose the aperture, camera chose the shutter speed. In shutter priority mode, you choose the shutter speed, camera chooses the aperture. In manual mode, you choose both. Okay, now that sounds a little bit scary. Don't worry, it's actually a lot easier than you think. So to go to full manual mode, you select M. It's pretty much the same on every camera. Now, what do you do next? You might think, I have no idea what combination of these I should use to get the right exposure. Don't worry about that. Here's what you do. Generally speaking, I will choose one of them, aperture or shutter speed, to set first. Often I will set aperture first. So in this case, I've set an aperture of 1/20th of a second. Oh, sorry, I've set an aperture of f5.6. You then turn your shutter speed dial, again your camera's manual will tell you which one that is, until the arrow settles on the 0. And in theory, that combination should be the correct exposure. So I've set f5.6, and then I move the dial until my arrow settles here on the 0, and in theory, that should be then at the correct shutter speed for that aperture in those light conditions. Because when you point your camera at a scene, it immediately begins to measure the light coming into it. It meters the light. Now, as we've learned already, sometimes setting at 0 doesn't always work, and sometimes we might deliberately underexpose by a stop or two, or we might deliberately overexpose by a stop or two, and that's just a question of trial and error. So, just to recap on that, when you're using full manual mode, start maybe by setting your aperture. So I'm doing a landscape, or say I'm taking a portrait in this case. So I'm going to use a wide aperture, 5.6, because I want to blur the background. And then I turn the shutter speed dial until the arrow settles on the 0. You can't actually see the arrow in this for some reason, but there will be an arrow or a little line and it'll settle on the 0. In theory, that's the correct exposure. In reality, it might be a little bit either side of that. You just experiment with it. So, just sum that up, set the aperture first, then change the shutter speed until the exposure chart is at 0, or vice versa. You might want to change the shutter speed first. If you're shooting sport, you want to make sure you have a very, very fast shutter speed, so you might want to prioritize that. Whatever you want to do, that's absolutely fine. There we just see the back of a camera again, how it works. And you can see the chart in there, you can see the little line under the 0. It's using a very wide aperture of f1.8. The ISO, as you can see there, is set at 400. I don't think it's displaying the shutter speed there for some reason. But there you can see the chart, that's the important part, and you see the little line under the 0. Okay, and as you change either the aperture or shutter speed, that will change as well. So start off at 0 and go from there. As you get more and more experience with photography, you'll get to know when you need to underexpose or overexpose deliberately. There's other modes on your camera. Sometimes cameras have portrait modes and landscape modes. What they do is they actually select what it thinks are the ideal combination of aperture and shutter speed for portraits or landscapes. So I mean, feel free to try them as well. I think it's better if you use aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual. Sometimes it's impossible to get the exposure correct. It just can't be done. I'm going to show you a picture I took many years ago in a church in France, in a town called Cahors. And the problem with shooting inside a church is you've got some very dark areas, like here in these alcoves and the arches. Very dark, yet the windows are very bright. Your camera simply can't handle that. There's too much of a contrast between the dark areas and the bright areas. So to overcome that problem, I actually took 7 different photographs. I kept my aperture the same for all of them because I wanted plenty of depth of field, so I think I used about f16, maybe f14, which ensured that everything was nice and sharp. And then I changed my shutter speed and I took a very dark photograph. Now it doesn't look very good, but at least there's detail in the windows. And then I gradually made them brighter and brighter. And as you can see, this one here is extremely bright, and it's so bright I've actually blown out the highlights in that part of the image. There's absolutely no detail in the walls there, it's completely white. However, I then blended all those images together. So let's just look at those again. See, getting darker and getting brighter. Blended those images together and you get a well exposed image. Now I'm not going to go into the details of how to do that. I just want to kind of illustrate to you what's possible. And that's something called exposure bracketing. When I take photographs, I will often bracket. Maybe not 7 photographs, but I'll often take 3. One at what I think is the correct exposure at the 0, or maybe could be a little less or more than that. And then I usually take one that's about 2 stops darker and one that's about 2 stops brighter. It's like an insurance policy. It means if I have problems with the exposure afterwards, I can blend the photographs to fix any issues that might be there. So let's just recap. Today we learned about the exposure triangle, we learned about aperture, okay, we learned about shutter speed, and we learned about ISO and how they work together to expose your photograph. There's a summary of our aperture, refers to the size of the hole that the light comes in to the lens. Okay, a narrow aperture is actually a high number, f22. A wide aperture is actually a low number, like f1.4. You can see it's a wide aperture there, blurs your background. Narrow aperture keeps everything nice and sharp. Shutter speed, again, we saw you can use very fast shutter speeds to freeze motion, for example somebody running, or you can use it to blur motion. Shutter speeds can be as slow as several minutes. And then ISO, we learned that ISO, by increasing your ISO, you amplify the light coming into the camera, which allows you to shoot in low light conditions and you can shoot handheld. It allows you to use faster shutter speeds, so your camera's not going to shake as much. However, there can be a trade-off with quality. The images get noisier or grainier the higher you go on the ISO, but I did say some of the newer cameras, especially full frame, actually handle the higher ISOs quite well. And then we have the modes. Aperture priority mode, you choose the aperture, the camera set what it thinks is the correct shutter speed to expose the photo properly. The shutter priority or time value on Canon cameras, where you select the shutter speed and the camera selects the aperture. We learnt about exposure compensation. If you find your images come out are dark or too bright. You can use this to brighten or darken the image. And then we looked at manual mode, where you set both aperture and shutter speed. And that is it. So what I'd encourage you to do is get out with your camera within your 2 kilometers distance, of course, even in your own garden, and experiment with the settings. Okay, have a look at aperture. Take a picture of the same thing using all the different apertures on your camera. Maybe set up with a tripod. Take a picture of you pouring water from a jug into a cup and set it at different shutter speeds and see what happens. And the best way to learn this is by experimenting. Take the picture of the same thing using all the different ISO levels in your camera. See what they look like. There's nothing better than actually doing this stuff for yourself. The most important thing is go out and enjoy it. And what I hope now is you can see is that you can actually get control over the final look of your photograph, that you're not letting the camera make those decisions for you. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I have. My voice is a bit sore, but I've never done anything like this before. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comment sections down below. Or if you have any feedback at all, please feel free to ask. I will also, in the description of this video below, put in a link to a text version of this tutorial that I wrote several years ago for petapixel.com, which is a photography website, and you can see everything I've spoken about today in text format with illustrating images. All the charts you've seen today are in it, so you can read back through that or print it off if you want to. The next class that I do in a few days will be on composition. So we've done the technical side of things. Now we're going to begin looking at the creative side of things. We're going to look at 20 composition techniques. So before I leave you here, I just want to say thanks for making it all the way to the end. If you did, well done. Stay safe. Keep washing the hands. Keep up the social distancing. We're going to flatten the curve, we're going to beat this thing, we're going to do it together. So this is Barry from Blanchardstown Library, part of the Fingal network of libraries, with our first photography lesson, and I'll see you the next time. Bye bye.